You're the king of cringe puns. If anyone's going to, it's going to be you.
Yeah, I gotta be in pun mood.
We'll just light the right candles, set the right background music, just get you in that pun mood. And
Yeah, I gotta be in pun mood to really pull out the good ones. And I have good ones. I mean, for people who hate puns, they're never gonna like my puns. But if you are into puns, I probably have a book. I probably have a book worth of puns. I mean, it is per Sunday.
What?
It's Sunday.
That's not a pun.
Well, I tried to merge the two concepts. Pun day. Sorry.
Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we all can do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the Zoom from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper on the human elements. I could go on for an eternity and have at times about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people than Kevin and I to get into it.
But when we do find those two people, we'll sure to have them on the show. On this week's episode, we'll be taking a look at the UK post office scandal and the various factors that led to the complete failure of that software platform. I think we'll also end up having to touch on the truly horrifying overlap of politics and commerce that led to half of those problems. So if you don't want to hear me on one of my rants about late-stage capitalism and neoliberalism, maybe skip this episode.
I actually think I would love to hear that. I would definitely like to hear you go on a rant and see what the fallout is. See who comes after us.
It's everyone's at fault in this one. Like, it goes all the way from Tony Blair to, it was originally the conservative Tories, then it was Tony Blair, and then it was the conservatives again. Like everyone's bad in this one.
There's no good guys. Well, one of the interesting parts of this too is, how do none of us know about this? Right? You could be forgiven.
Right?
You could be forgiven because maybe you don't read the BBC News, but I feel ashamed that it was reading through the entertainment section that I finally stumbled upon a BBC drama that highlighted this whole issue. It wouldn't have been on my list of research had I not stumbled upon this show, this 4-part drama on the BBC. I believe it was the BBC.
I thought it was ITV.
Oh, ITV. ITV, yeah. BBC. And really then my reading, it just took over. I spent like the next hour reading about this just injustice. Let's call it an injustice by everybody.
Sure.
Everybody. And
Right.
How did I not know about it? Shame on me.
I mean, there's too much going on. That's why a bunch of these, that's how this stuff gets away with it, is our culture is full of, we're aware of everything in a way that 30 years ago we weren't. There were 3 channels and you were aware of just the 2 things going on.
I love that you bring that up because it is that part of the problem, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Did they genuinely believe, like, everybody is so distracted, like they must be looking at current events saying, hey, that's great, somebody just got bombed, so this thing is not going to be on the front cover, so we're not going to get the kind of unwanted attention. And is that really how sadistic it is and simple it is? They're really looking at the media for, this thing's not on the front page yet, so we're good to keep covering it up.
Well, and I know that there are things like, you do the bad news Friday at 4 p.m. right as the market's closing and as nobody cares because they're about to go away for the weekend, and the news media doesn't work that way. I wonder if that's slightly different now with social media and 24/7 cable news, but I still do think that there's a bunch of ways that they can find the right time to drop that note. Just a warning for our listeners, we do end up talking about the consequences of the situation, which does include suicide, so just a heads up for folks. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Market Analysis, where we'll look at a product or app or technology and talk through our impressions, how we think some of the product and engineering decisions were made to arrive at how the thing works, and share our thoughts on how good or bad we think it is. How good or bad we think it is this week is, it's all bad. It's just all bad. Today's topic is the Horizon countertop sales and accounting system at the heart of the UK post office scandal. We'll include a bunch of links in the show notes if folks want to read more about this, including a post on the blog digging into some of this even further. I guess the first thing we should do is break down the timeline of what happened and how we got here. In 1995, a company called ICL, which was a subsidiary of the Japanese company Fujitsu, won a contract with the UK government to automate various functions of the regional post offices. It promised that within 3 years it would be rolled out to 19,000 post office branches, with several goals, including processing 890 million transactions from 19 million people and reducing the number of fraudulent benefit claims by £150 million a year. By replacing the paper tills with an electronic point of sale system, it should have saved post office operators time and effort, both during the transaction with the customer and in things like end of month reporting on expected cash balances. Remember, this is the 90s. The US and UK are both convinced that welfare fraud is the worst thing in the world, and we're also seeing the shift from public owned infrastructure to the public private partnership model where governments cede control and authorship to private companies, which I don't think we're going to get into all of that topic today. There are plenty of valid reasons to think a private company will have hired talented people in a way that government probably wouldn't have. The company ICL originally pushed to use a new smart card system to automate the processing of benefits, but the government pushed back and wanted to use the more reliable and tested magnetic strip technology. That'll be important in a second. The project, known as Pathway at the time, immediately falls behind schedule, and by 1997, ICL is insisting that it will have to increase by 30% the originally small percentage of every one of those benefit transactions that it was planning on taking. At the same time, the government then turns around and starts to worry that the magnetic strip technology is becoming outdated, which, in the rare case that I'll defend this company, ICL had recommended going with a smart card from the outset. By 1998, the UK government is panicking and considers pulling the plug. The project has now cost £1 billion, meaning it's now at least a decade away from recouping its own costs. Fujitsu calls the UK ambassador to Japan into their offices and lets them know all of the economic impacts that canceling the contract will have, and basically threatens the UK. Eventually, the benefits agency drops out of the project in 1999, opting to go for direct bank account transfers, what we know today as ACH, how most people get direct deposits from their employers. And the project is renamed to Horizon as its scope is reduced to simply automating the post office branches. Coincidentally, I'm sure the announcement of the Horizon project happens literally the day before ICL is set to announce its annual financial performance, in which it has to write off part of this project as a massive failure. Also, Fujitsu has been planning to bring ICL public with an IPO in 2000 and cannot afford to admit that there's anything really wrong. The rollout to the post offices begins slowly in 1999 and takes several years as they try and roll out 300 branches a week. It's a massive undertaking. And almost immediately, the post office branch managers, known as sub-postmasters, start reporting problems. They claim their own records of transactions don't match up with what the Horizon system claims is happening. The post office, however, just assumes that these sub-postmasters are liars and tells them that the software can't possibly be at fault and that the sub-postmasters will have to make up the difference themselves. These post office branch managers serve relatively tiny communities across Great Britain and are now on the hook for sometimes several £1,000s of supposedly missing money. Dozens start to go broke and into financial ruin as they try to make up for the difference. As these cases arise, some of the sub-postmasters can't afford to pay, and so the post office uses some weird British law to privately prosecute these poor people, sending hundreds of people to jail. Except it turns out the Horizon software system is massively buggy, and there are known problems with most of it, but one system in particular, known as the cash account, the system that logs all of the transactions, is flawed from the start, and that's exactly where these financial discrepancies were coming from. We'll dig into that in more detail in a bit. But ICL, now fully part of Fujitsu, insists there's nothing wrong. They claim there are 11,000 branches all running perfectly fine, so these small numbers of sub-postmasters must be the real culprits. And the UK judicial system goes along with it. And while Fujitsu is in court claiming they don't have the ability to remotely access the systems and edit or validate the data, that was untrue, and they allegedly frequently did access branch data. Over the next 20 years, several of these sub-postmasters start to organize and fight back, and eventually get a court case against the post office, settled out of court for £60 million, although £48 million of that has to go to cover the legal costs, and the post office isn't forced to admit wrongdoing, and none of the wrongful convictions are overturned. Several government inquiries start to slowly look at whether these convictions should be overturned, and it was in January of this year when a 4-part miniseries dramatizing the whole situation aired on ITV, and almost 10 million Brits were suddenly outraged. So now the government had to step in and say they would start to take more decisive action to rectify these bad convictions. So where do we begin in breaking down all of this? There's so many things that go wrong every step of the way.
First is shout out to Toby Jones, who plays the lead role of Alan Bates, and then also calling out Alan Bates, who is one of the key players in this whole drama, a guy who not alone but wouldn't let this fight go, right? And that's all it takes sometimes is one person energizes a couple more, and then this thing's never swept under the rug. So
Right.
big shout out to the cast of Mr. Bates versus the Post Office on ITV. If you happen to catch ITV, you should check out that show. And then Alan Bates and the extended group that just wouldn't let this thing die, because we wouldn't be talking about this had I not been reading through the entertainment section of BBC and
Right.
found this story.
Toby Jones, who plays the Nazi computer program in the MCU,
That
if
is
anyone's
correct.
trying to place the face.
Yeah, that is correct. I might have pulled out another movie, but yeah, that's probably the one that springs to mind now for both.
I mean, listen, we're talking about broken software systems, and there's nothing more broken than a Nazi computer head.
In all fairness, though, the system that Toby Jones worked on in the Marvel universe would be described as
Worked.
anything other than broken. I mean, we were seconds away from from that
True.
system, yeah, fulfilling its
Taking
promise.
over fully.
Yeah. So just a big shout out to all the players. For me, yeah, I think that the last section you discussed, 10 million Brits becoming suddenly outraged. So how many of them didn't know? How many of them are just have breezed over that in the news for years, and then finally a TV drama about this software failure is now like explainable. They understand it, right? So there's a portion of the population who probably don't really even understand point of sale system and the software and the database and bad accounting and what that all means. So 10 million people getting outraged, and then the government finally deciding that they're going to quash the convictions of, I think it's around 700 sub postmasters in these small post offices. Like, why does it take a quarter of a century for a government to step in and say, yeah, we see the logic here, right? We see that the system is broken. Fascinating.
Well, and how many other things would four episodes in front of 10 million people, like that's a huge number, but also a relatively small effort. I don't know, like I'm not minimizing the effort that went into making this miniseries, but 4 episodes over, this premiered on January 1st. It's January 14th when we're recording this. This is a brief amount of time to galvanize massive action. How many more miniseries do we need to write and put in front of people to rectify how many things that are going on in the world? That's good and horrifying.
It's horrifying in the sense that I think it has to be a TV drama to galvanize, right? Reading the news, when it comes back to, I don't understand it. I'm reading this and it's not my domain of experience, so I'm not galvanized. Or two, are they reading it and they're just not moved emotionally, right? Like, oh, it sucks for that. It's only 1,000 people who are affected going to prison and their lives ruined. Then they see a TV drama that's meant to pull on the heartstrings and they're suddenly galvanized. So there's probably a good conversation for another day, which is, what else should we be turning into TV dramas to get people to move on in society, right?
Right. Well, and also one of the worst examples of I think an 18-month jail sentence for a woman who was pregnant, but she was a minority woman. And I do wonder that the, middle-aged white dude at the front of the story being part of that calculus probably is an uncomfortable thing that no one wants to figure out if that's how much of a factor that is.
Yeah, I love her stance too, and I her name escapes me right now, but I love her stance. She just flat out said, I'm never going to admit guilt to something I just didn't do." Right? You can
Right.
sort of play the legal system and see like, hey, I plead guilty and I get a plea deal here, but she was just unwilling to waver in her sort of morals and ethics and just said, no, I didn't do this. I'm not going to admit to it. So, but what a sacrifice these people went through. And it's difficult to know where to start on something like this, but maybe we could talk a little bit about the project scope and the rush, the requirements. As a product guy, what are you looking at? What are you thinking? Are you ever getting caught in that situation, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. So you go back to the start, it's 1995, they have this goal, but they don't have a goal. They have several goals, and each goal is massive. They have the concern over welfare fraud, and so they want to save 150 million pounds a year by automating and having a system that's going to catch fraudulent situations. But then lumping on top of that, that's for the benefits agency. And I guess the benefits agency maybe they didn't do stuff through the post office, and they thought the post office was a good place to start doing it, or maybe they already were doing it. You would know more about British infrastructure of the early 90s, but at that point, did someone say like, well, we already have people going to the post office to do this thing, and we want to use technology to solve a problem? I won't get on my liberal soapbox about how much of an actual problem that was worth solving and how much money you spent to solve something, but in that situation, it's an understandable, like I probably do this sometimes, which is looking at it and being like, well, we're already going to be in the post office solving one thing that happens in the post office, and isn't it kind of annoying how much time people have to spend on paper transactions? It's the 90s. Technology is the thing we can take advantage of now. now. So let's have technology help with all of the post office transactions and all of the stuff that these post office people have to work on and do end of month accounting. There's accounting software we could take advantage of. I get the inclination to go and say, hey, we're already here solving problems. Let's solve all of these problems. They're all adjacent to one another. But now you have two different agencies, each with their own competing set of requirements. The post office has its 42 workflows that they want to put into this software. The benefits agency has its own set of requirements. The company looking at it says, great, the way we can do this is with one technology. And the government comes in and says, well, yeah, but we have all of this existing infrastructure with this older technology. So no, don't do that thing, do this thing instead. So you have all of these competing requirements. I don't know how you were ever going to be successful. I don't think this project ever could have been successful. I think this is, we ragged on the agile framework. I think this is a very good example of you should have picked one problem. And yes, you could have done the work to make sure that you were building a foundation to build other solutions, but pick one problem and solve it really well and then iterate on that.
I'm glad you mentioned agile because it's important for the listeners who some of the newer engineers, people who maybe don't track process as much. But this is early enough that this is pre-agile. So we're presumably in a waterfall space at that time, or at least some version of waterfall, which would have had extensive amounts of documentation and analysis as to what they were building or not. Was this a project that was such a catch-all with so many different stakeholders that the waterfall process wasn't actually there at all? And it was really, we're in there. There's a million things for us to do. So let's just get as many stakeholders around the table. And it'd be really interesting to see how descriptive the deliverable was and how close it was to the end product.
Yeah, I'm looking in one of the articles where they have the whistleblower.
And while you do that, it's important for the listeners. People died. People died in this. There's at least 4 cases of suicide that were linked to postmasters. So 4 people actually died. So it is actually, technically to me, it's a tragedy, right? People died during this quarter of a century cover-up. I'll call it a cover-up. I get in trouble for that. Get chased out of Britain next time I go back. But
allegedly, we'll just say allegedly in front of everything.
Thank you. Alleged cover-up. So it's a very serious matter.
I can't find the example, but the whistleblower was saying basically when they came in, they were a consultant who was brought in to work on the system in the 90s, and there were no requirements. There were no detailed design specs. There was nothing in there. And so yeah, I would have to imagine that the answer is you had people who just were not ready for a project of this size and scope, and they started gathering requirements, gathering input from people, and didn't know how to manage it, and it absolutely ballooned out of control.
So that is probably the inmates are running the asylum, right? The inmates are running the asylum, and I read the book many, many years ago. I will definitely get the listeners the more detail on that. But the term anyway, the inmates are running the asylum, which suggests the people in control shouldn't be in control. So it sounds a lot like that. It sounds a lot like developers just making decisions along with product and business owners potentially with no guidance from a visionary.
Right. And when the benefits agency shows up and says, I need these 4 things in order to make the magnetic card work, and then the next day the post office comes in and says, well, have you thought about what's going to happen when we need to do shipped parcels and not just postage stamps? And now which one do you work on first? Which one? What if they have conflicting capability requirements? Like all of the things that you would expect product people to do and help you rationalize and make trade-offs and choices. And yeah, there's just so many things that it's clear no one was in charge of this.
Yep. And for our listeners, if you want to check that book out, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, it's by Alan Cooper. And I read it many years ago, probably worth a reread now, but I definitely recommend in situations like this. It kind of covers the what happens when you put a chimp in front of the flight controls of a plane, a passenger plane, basically.
Well, and I think the other thing that was fascinating is somehow they committed in 1995, 96, something like that it was going to be 3 years. They somehow knew ahead of time without all of the requirements defined what the date was going to be, which is your number one sign of a problem. It's one thing if you want to commit to a date and then you're able to cut things out because you can't commit to that. You can't reach that date. But, another reason why the software industry has changed over the last 20 years is because those kinds of date commitments become incredibly difficult when you don't have the flexibility ability to decide what is now out of scope if we want to hit that date, or the date is moved because we want to hit certain requirements. Engineering is hard and difficult, and things come up, and that's good. You want people to find the weird situation they weren't accounting for. You want them to find the bug and fix it. I'd rather you deliver this in June instead of March because you rolled out something that's good. But also the scope of it. You somehow think you're going to roll out to 20 something thousand branches, 300 branches a week. Most software companies aren't designed to do that. That's a completely different implementation skill set. There's a reason why Microsoft has ISV partners who know how to implement Microsoft solutions, because that's a different skill set than writing software and all of the things that go into actually implementing it. And that part's not clear to me either. Was it the Fujitsu company going out to hundreds of branches every week? That's insane.
Yeah. You also have to remember, though, the British Post Office was very much like the Apple stores today. It was a real hub of technology with some really sharp technology. I'm obviously joking, but yeah, it's a fantastic point. Like, I can't think of a more antiquated place to go into. Like, when you walk into a British Post Office, it's like stepping back 50 years. Like, you're in there buying stamps. You know, there's the flat-capped old guy and the lady with the groceries, the old lady with her groceries. Like, it's not a place of innovation. It never was. I never really think of the post office as being a place of innovation. Even to this day, I don't walk in the British post office and get that feeling. So it was extremely ambitious. But then, if you don't mind me flipping this here and talking a little bit, can we speculate about the size of a team that it would take to roll out software of this magnitude to that many post office branches? Like, what kind of team size are we looking at?
I don't even, they're claiming 300 a week. And if you think about the actual implementation of this is a touch screen, which is phenomenal in 1999 or whatever. Maybe it's not. Maybe point of sale systems had touch screens, I suppose, at that point. But still, it's a touch screen, a keyboard, a computer under the desk, and then a server in the back room. So assuming everything goes right every single time, you're still talking several hours of finding the way to wire this up. Does it have a power source? Where's the Ethernet cable running through? Where's the server going to live? Did they have the things that you would have of what's the backup power supply? What are the ways that you're doing this? Are you wiring Ethernet into a building for the first time? 300 a week. Let's assume it's half a day each location. So that's 150. Yeah, so that's 150 people. No, what's the math I'm trying to do here? So 300 in a week. You can do 2 a day. So that's 150. And therefore, you need to have 150 people. Kevin from the future, while editing this episode, to say we then forgot to do the math of dividing by 5 days a week. So that would be 30 people. All right, back to the episode.
And then what we've all had rollout issues with distributed systems, right? So this is an early distributed system. You start looking at the production support. So how many engineers? What's the level 1, 2, and 3 for support looking like? What's the maintenance period? How many engineers? Allegedly, it's a handful of engineers on this project. I think we're talking less than 10 core developers overseeing this project. Is that correct?
That's what I read. And so now when it turns out that, okay, well, branch number 712 is still on dial-up, so it turns out that actually the retry rate for the server code has to be 45 seconds instead of 15 seconds. Is that a ticket that now one of those 8 to 10 people is responsible for fixing? Are they going to fix it before Sally, the technician, leaves that location that day? No. So now that the entire infrastructure of this process is bananas.
Yeah, and then we can only speculate on the expertise of that team too, right? There's so little published, and understandably, they never released a full bug list, which is probably, some of that is IP, protecting IP. Some of it's the government and the postal system and benefits. So you really don't want that kind of recipe to be out there, and indicators of how the system is easily exploitable. But they never release the full bug list, and they don't talk in great detail about the size of that team or the expertise of that team. But we do have some, during testimony, there was some suggestion that half the team was fairly inexperienced. But what are we talking about? Like, what's the number of architects, like the level of expertise for that type of engineer for this scale? Is it a case that this is before its time? Obviously, the quality of it, but is a system of this magnitude before its time?
I mean, I think we've all been there, right? You've worked with an engineering team where you've got, even if they're 4 really smart kids out of college, they don't have the experience to have worked on these things and known what pitfalls to avoid. And so how many times do you then have the remaining 4 to 5 people who are also varying degrees of experience and skill set? And so it ends up being that every single meeting, Jamie is the only one, she's the only one who can come and help help you troubleshoot the thing and has to get it pulled into every single decision. And that doesn't scale and doesn't work. And so now you're starting to triage and troubleshoot your own list of bugs and requirements to figure out, okay, well, Jamie's the one who has to work on these 10 because we can't give to, Scott and Matt, the ones that are going to be the more junior folks who can work on. You're now troubleshooting your own team to troubleshoot the situations going on. You're making bad decisions as a result of that. I would hope, given the cost of this, that's the other question. I mean, I'd be curious, someone should be investigating, how did you spend $1 billion on a team with 8 engineers?
Yeah, I like what you brought up there about the expertise level of the junior engineers, because you do get it. They do crank through code quite often, telling it junior engineers, but when they start to, some of the experience that they might not have is what you do with offline situations. Right. And this is particularly true at the time period where you brought up that the difference in the quality of the network on sites. Right. So today we have edge providers for POS systems that you have complex patterns, you have caching, you have offline processing. What do we do when the system's down? We want to continue accepting orders, but we can reconcile those orders back to home base. Right. So those types of advanced patterns are not generally something that you would be dealing with in the first couple of years out of school. And I believe the cash account system had some of those issues that we're talking about. Is that correct?
Yeah. According to the whistleblower, one of the systems, cash account, which is sort of at the root of a bunch of these financial issues, was understandably doing an async transfer. So yeah, it's 1997 to 1999 into the early 2000s. Your internet connection quality is going to be questionable at best. So you correctly design a system that says, wait, let me hold off and make sure that I only transmit when I know I have an internet connection. Great. Except apparently it turns out they didn't correctly build that asynchronous process, and so now it was possible for the central remote hub that's receiving the information and sending back confirmations and possibly overwriting data as it tries to do reconciliation, would do reconciliation before you had sent that day's transactions. And so the asynchronous process was poorly designed and couldn't account for all of those scenarios. The internet's down for 2 hours, and what happens to the transactions during those 2 hours. And so apparently the cash account, which is responsible for keeping track of all of the transactions and making sure that a sub postmaster is not considered to be fraudulent, was actually possibly overwriting data or under reporting data back to the central hub. And so of course you then had inconsistencies. And of course, if you're sitting in the post office central office and looking at the report coming in from, I don't know, I can't make up a fake British name of a tiny little town that you're
John Smith. John Smith is
John
Smith is our John Doe.
Gotcha. I was more thinking like Hertfordshire upon Tyne Borough or whatever weird little town that you're living in. If you're the person looking at the report for that tiny little thing, and yesterday the cash balance was £9,000 and today the cash balance is £7,000, but there's no transactions accounting for the £2,000 difference, then you're looking at that going, what's this person, what's John Smith up to in my little branch here? And trying to figure out, do they owe us £2,000? Is that fraud? What's going on? Except, turns out that's because the software was written poorly and didn't know how to account for asynchronous message communication, which again, possibly, no, actually, I was going to say possibly advanced pattern for 1999. No, it wasn't. Server client infrastructure had been the norm for the past 15, 20 years. Everyone should have known how to do that. So again, the skill set of this software team, where did Fujitsu spend $1 billion?
Yeah, it's interesting. And you brought up the classic, I call them classic British names because, yeah, we pretty much, we do have some classic British, well, they're just classic. Let's leave it there. I think the Dalmellington bug, which I believe is in Scotland, was one of the bugs which would update records silently during a frozen screen. So we have probably a system performance issue which freezes the screen. A user understandably is thinking, well, a couple of key presses here shouldn't hurt the system. Maybe it's locked up and I just need to keep pushing the enter key here. But that was actually one of the bugs that would silently update the record behind the scenes. So I believe the Dalmellington bug was responsible for a £24,000 misstep in the system, which someone was eventually held accountable for. One of the postmasters was held accountable for the discrepancy between the actual number and that £24,000 number, which is, again, just, I've seen these things in the last 20 years. I've been to websites where maybe 10, 15 years ago, you're on the credit card transaction page, you hit the transaction, and then I've been in a situation where my 2-year-old's on my lap and manages to hit the F5 and refresh, and the transaction goes
Right.
through again. But yeah, modern systems protect against that. But you would think that for something so fundamentally close to the accounting accounting system, that bug never sees the light of day, right?
Well, and that's, the value of QA can never be overstated in my mind. And one of the things that we talked about in the Agile framework discussion is the Scrum implementation of Agile sometimes incorporates QA, but a lot of the times that's just a thing that gets in the way of getting value quickly in front of people. And you need to make sure someone in QA would have noticed that in a way that the engineer might not have.
Yeah, and I'd also, just to plug for myself here and other enterprise architects, this is where an enterprise architect, or why an enterprise architect exists, because this one's also a difficult QA scenario to recreate, right? Network issues. But I think a lot of enterprise architects are trained to, and maybe to the discomfort and annoyance of everyone, to sit there in a design session and stand by their principles and say, that design right there has problems, right? And the best enterprise architects will actually be able to walk you through the scenario to say, let's talk about the network for a second, right? The delay and the latency of this transaction here is a problem because we can get into a situation where, yeah, these accounting issues occur. So they are complex, certainly for our non-technical listeners. Some of these quality assurance criteria are hard to recreate,
That's
right? Because
fair.
they're complex network issues. But I think, again, yeah, the plug for the enterprise architect, you would hope with the types of patterns that we see today in the library of enterprise architecture patterns would be able to pull those scenarios out of their head and say, yeah, these are, and a talented engineer could do that too, would be able to see these problems and suggest that, yeah, we need to fix this pattern before it goes to production.
You would also hope an architect or someone with a little bit more experience would have noticed the other problem with cash account, which is that it's 1990, whatever, late 90s. XML is the big rage. Everybody loves XML. It's this amazing, perfect data format that you can do anything you want in it, which is technically true. The downside of it is because you can do anything you want in it, you can do anything you want in it. And so what ended up happening in the cash account is the system that recorded these financial transactions had no standard, what we would call a data dictionary or data contract, enforcing the way that it received data points. And so that the engineer who wrote the code to process the postage stamp transaction could decide, I'm going to call it order date and order amount and something else. And then the engineer who wrote the shipping parcel transaction was going to call it date of transaction and financial currency integer, or like they had no standards of the way that they would log all of this stuff. And so then you had no way of knowing how to process those transactions. And of course, data then got missed when it was reported back to the central hub.
Yeah, and that for our technical listeners, that's truly Conway's law at play, right? That is classic Conway's law. Two teams not discussing an interface, no data contract. In this situation, where people died, it's catastrophic. So that lack of data dictionary is catastrophic to the failure of this system. We also have one of the other bugs that was released was the calendar bug, which creates clear duplications in the database, which leads to not necessarily my interest in the bug. Duplicate transactions in the database is fairly obvious, which for somebody who had access at Fujitsu would immediately pop out at you and you would say, we got duplicate transactions, just bad. There was an alleged denial that anybody had remote access to the database to see those duplicate transactions, but that's actually been allegedly disproven as part of the testimony. And there was actually remote access. So somebody from the support or the engineering group would have been able to see those duplicate transactions.
An interesting thing that the whistleblower said was that something like cash account was very clearly the MVP that they wrote during the proposal process to prove that they could do it. And then they never actually upgraded it from an MVP to a real solution. And then it was 3 years of code tacked on top of this faulty underlying system. And his answer to people was, you must rewrite this system. And he turned down a promotion because they refused to rewrite that one system. I think we've all been there. We all do the MVP work so we can close the deal with the client at the end of the month. And then we're told that we're going to get to do the correct version. And then that correct version never gets prioritized because we won the client business and it does what it needs to do for that one client. And then we start building on top of it. And I think that's a really good example of where everyone involved needs to be able to figure out how to push back on those decisions and undo the MVP work into the real production work eventually.
That's an amazing point. And I've been in that situation a few times myself where I've written an MVP, even just a POC to prove to business like, hey, it could work this way. And the amount of times I've been asked, well, can we just use this?
Yep.
That's a common theme that I've experienced over the last 20, 25 years. So yeah, that's an interesting point.
I'm not telling people that their MVP is going to cause the Challenger explosion, but I'm also not telling them that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm glad I stumbled upon this story because it's been right in line with my
Yeah.
thinking over the last month, where I've actually been asking myself, like, we talk about mission critical systems, we talk about software and hardware that runs inside of hospitals. Elizabeth Holmes, obviously, and the name of the company is slips my mind. It's a very unusual.
Oh yeah, what is Elizabeth Holmes' company
Yeah, what
name?
is? What, give me a second. It's anxiety holding me back from pulling it out. It was Theranos. Theranos.
Theranos.
How do you say it?
Theranos, I
You
think?
say it better than I say Theranos.
Theranos, like a Marvel villain.
Yeah, Theranos. Theranos. So
She is a Marvel villain.
very much a mission critical system. People's
Yes.
health, their life. You look at the post office system, there's nothing mission critical about it in the terms of human life, which is proving to be inaccurate, right? We've always viewed mission critical systems as military systems, health and medical systems, but now you're looking at the post office and you say, well, it's not a mission critical system until things go wrong and then people's lives are impacted. And now it is mission critical because there are 4 people, maybe more, but there are 4 definite suicide victims because of the system, because of the story of the system. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the last month. What is a mission critical system? And then when did they become mission critical?
Well, and I think that's what I was trying to figure out earlier is obviously, like, I'm not defending any of the Fujitsu decisions, but as a person doing risk analysis in the late 90s against the post office accounting system, it's a bad decision, but you're probably not thinking you're on the level of the military, the healthcare, the Challenger explosion. If you decide to screw some people over by not fixing your bugs, your initial reaction is probably not that large. And I think that's where I think all of us need to do a better job of understanding you are providing software that helps somebody run, a TikTok promotion. Sure, you probably don't think that the impact of that is very big, but when their TikTok promotion goes wrong and the brand that they were trying to help promote sues you for the $100,000 that you can't pay them to make up for the failure of the campaign, that's a stressful situation for that person getting sued.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And maybe part of the problems with the original thinking around mission critical systems is that it only took the software and the actual physical architecture to be classified as a mission critical system. But when you start to put your users and your customers into the greater process, right? Does it become mission critical when the actual business processes now reach into the customer's lives, right? So
Right.
now they're accepting personal liability for the failings of the software. Right, so maybe mission critical needs a slightly broader definition, not on paper, but at least in our thinking. Is what are my customers going to go through when they use this software? Right, it's a
Yep.
from the simple case of like, well, look, this email campaign hit 300,000 people instead of 100,000 because of failings in the system, which mean I overspent on my campaign for the agencies I represent, right? That it's not great on your performance review, right? Into this case where it was much more dramatic, where people were actually, their personal assets were up for grabs from the government. So yeah, fascinating subject. Which leads to how much of this was fear to sweep under the rug. It sounds inexplicable, right? Which is, we know this thing is fundamentally broken, and we're living under the notion that maybe I'm going to find a job before it becomes a problem and I have to worry about it. How much of this was just humans enforcing their own fears and saying, I'll be gone by the time this is really a problem? And then, is that even possible? Is it possible that that existed at the human level, but then also at an organizational level where they just said, we're just going to let this thing keep being broken forever in hope that we outlive, or there's just not enough attention on fixing it? Like, how is that possible?
Yeah, I think, to a bunch of the engineer and manager credits, the people who have spoken up about this, they were raising these concerns in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. They were bringing this to the attention of, ICL and Fujitsu. And I think that's, we've all probably been in that situation where we notice a thing and then the business makes a decision anyways. And we know that it's a bad decision. And there's only so much span of control that a person at certain levels has. And I don't know from what we've read that we have enough insight to understand where in that decision-making process it broke down. But as I was talking about earlier, there were so many financial incentives involved in what was going on at the time. They were a company that was owned by Fujitsu. They were trying to go public and have an IPO. They were trying to deal with all of the things that go into the stock market and earnings reports and all of those kinds of things. And so the more that they could shift the blame and say, well, that's just human human beings. Of course, these people are, committing fraud. That's not the system's responsibility. The better your company looks and the better your financial situation is. And we don't know from the testimony and the decisions that have been made. No one's been charged with any crimes yet, but somewhere someone was making the calculus, like you're saying, that it's better for the company and for my financial performance to not admit wrongdoing, not admit that there are bugs, not admit there are things going on. And that's, I'm not going to say understandable as in I'm giving them a pass, but that's a human thing that happens so freaking often.
Yeah, and it's interesting because all of this starts a decade after the Challenger disaster, but we saw the same failings, and I think you could maybe suggest even in the Columbia disaster. But and I'm going to butcher the name, but I believe it was Theocol was the third party engineering group that worked on NASA components during Challenger, and they had raised concerns about the O-rings in Challenger
Right.
before the launch, and again that was a human decision to say we're going to ignore the data, we're going to ignore the expertise, and we're going to carry on, and we all know how Challenger tragically ended. But how many more times are we going to repeat this? Is it inevitable that we're so flawed as a system that in 200 years, more AI driven versions of Kevin and Andrew talking about this, saying, hey, look at what the stupid humans did again, right? They ignored their own failings of the past. Are we always going to be this way?
I mean, the AI will have been programmed by humans and will make all of the same mistakes. That is the ultimate Conway's law.
And actually, probably the scary part of that is to the extent, right? The scale of which we've inflicted our own stupidity on the world. That's going to be the true story with AI.
That's the thing is, if you're the NASA administrators who make that ridiculous choice, lives are on the line. I suppose you could try and argue that at some early stage, a financial decision in this situation with the post office about accounting software, and you're looking at it and being like, no, we can't admit to that. It'll risk the whatever. A person may not think through the human implications of that, but as soon as jail sentences were being handed down, as soon as people were going broke as a result of that, the human consequence was very real. And then people died as a result of this. The stress on those folks was so significant. And I think that's one of those things. I'm not necessarily trying to tell everybody listening to this that every single one of your decisions has a massive human implication that could lead to death. But also, maybe you should consider that every decision you make does have some human consideration, and even if it's a small financial stress, don't be a dick. Don't cause suffering, regardless of the scale of that suffering is small to catastrophic.
Yeah, and I want to give a big shout out here to Diane Vaughn, who's an American sociologist and professor at Columbia University, at least according to online records, she still is. And her work on the paper Normalization of Deviance. And anybody who knows me has probably heard me sprout this one many, many times. I love the work that Diane Vaughn did on this. It talks a little bit about the culture and how we normalize deviance. Having worked in multiple financial companies, I've seen it myself. I've seen the engineer who has access to the database, and it becomes even an operational practice to do deviant things to fix issues in production. You saw compliance standards like Sarbanes-Oxley and GDPR come out, which look to tackle, like, oftentimes the failings of humans to adhere to law and practice and regulations. But it's a great paper if anybody it's a short paper, but it's a great paper if anybody wants to go read about how NASA was really subject to normalization of deviance. And I believe that the Post Office and Horizon and Fujitsu, it's a great read because it will actually start to help you understand how, these human deviant behaviors, and they're not always necessarily started with deviance in mind, but they become deviant over time. But it's a great read, and I strongly suggest people go check that paper out.
Well, and I think that's where this is a human problem. I won't say that had this been a government-run program that things like this couldn't have happened, and I think plenty of governments, both conservative and liberal, fall into this trap. And so this is not a ideological thing. Well, it might be because my belief of what government could be seems fairly ideological these days. But in a corporate situation in which your incentive is your own prevention of your own suffering, in which your financial incentives are to make the company more successful, then, like you're saying, your reasoning and your decision making starts to get skewed in a way that, I know this is a blue sky Pollyanna view of government, but if the goal of the government program is the benefit of the citizenry, then you make different decisions. You are not financially driven. You get paid no matter what. You're just making the right call for how this would be implemented. And these decisions, if we need to delay it because there's so many bugs that we can't get it out, then delay it. I think you saw a version of this with Obamacare, where the rollout of the ACA had a ton of bugs, and they invested in solving that because the goal of the government was the successful launch of this program, not the financial X, Y, and Z balance sheet scenario. And so I do think that part of this is my hope that in situations where you can remove financial incentives, better decisions get made because your goal is an altruistic, beneficial goal, not that it needs to make money. And I think that's one of the things I was noticing as I was writing up our notes about this. One of the comments I made is from a 90s perspective, the fact that it cost $1 billion and was only going to save 150 million in benefits fraud, another couple of tens of millions in annual costs of implementing the manual paper version, that the cost benefit analysis was now skewed. They were going to have to write it off as a loss. And it's one of those things where at some point, a government shouldn't be thinking about things as a profit or a loss. You're providing a service to your citizens. Right now in the US, they're all obsessed about the US post office isn't turning a profit. Good. Who cares? It shouldn't. That's not the way the mechanism works. We're paying taxes to receive a service. If those taxes need to go up or down because of the quality of the service, it's not a profit situation. The government doesn't need to make money. The government needs to simply afford the things that it's delivering. And if we all agree that we want to get more out of this service, then that money needs to come from somewhere. But it's not a revenue generating source. That's not how government programs should work. And the reason for that is exactly this scenario. The reason you don't want the government to be in the business of making money is because then people make bad decisions in search of profit and revenue. And that's not the way I want my government to run. And so I will get off my little liberal soapbox there, but I do think it's a perfect example of why, whether or not this should be corporate incentives, government incentives, when you make decisions based on how much money it's going to make you, bad things happen.
Yeah, and just so our listeners know that Kevin and I are not always on the same page with these. I'm all for making money, but I will also support Kevin in saying I think until humans and normalization of deviance isn't a thing and we have good standards, then I agree with him. Like, don't be in a situation where you're trying to milk something and you don't have the expertise, you don't have the infrastructure, the cost outweighs the demand. I do agree. I think the interesting sociological aspect to all of this that I would like to leave the listeners with is what type of engineer or product manager are you? Are you the type that's going to stand up and at times sacrifice yourself, right? Are you going to be the whistleblower? Are you going to be the one who said, I can see where this leads. I can see the damage this does. I can see the cost that everybody is taking on to make this project work. And I think that's what NASA really came out with, was certainly in the case of the Challenger, and I would believe in the Columbia as well, is not being silent when things are unsafe, right? We want to have a culture where people can be whistleblowers in their organization, not necessarily to media outlets. They shouldn't feel like they have to do that. They should feel that they're in an environment where they can break the silence and say, hey, there's a problem, and allow people to come forward with I believe the quote they released was, we must allow people to come forward with their concerns without fear of repercussion. That, and along with the complacency, becoming complacent within a company to just churn out dangerous software, churn out dangerous technology. Again, that's a lot to ask though, right? We're asking humans to forget about the two kids at home and the spouse, and we're saying in your company you're going to go up against the hierarchy to highlight the problem. But I like to, maybe I'm an optimist and I believe there are people out there who will always do the right thing. I'm constantly asking myself that question. But yeah, that's something for the listeners to think about, is what type of person are you? Are you going to band together and make sure it's fixed?
Agreed. Well, and I think that's a thing that hopefully people would want to apply to everything, not just safety, but just every decision that you hear about. We just did our 2023 review, and I was sort of joking at the start of my introduction for my team that the best thing I've had from my team over the past 6 months of coming up to speed on this product line is they have had no problem telling me when I'm wrong and when I need to do something differently. And it's that kind of every part of your job, people should feel like they can come to you and tell you this isn't the right way to do things. I want my team to disagree with me, not just for safety reasons, but for every reasons. Everything is better when everyone feels like they can bring that kind of stuff to you.
I'm guessing that kind of feedback took maybe half a day, maybe a whole day.
Oh, the list of things I'm doing wrong just is unending. Yeah, I have 10 people reporting into me. It's a lot.
But joking aside, I think that one of the reasons I've been drawn to you over the 15 years we've known each other now, and other people that I've been drawn to, is you see an inherent qualities about people, right? They're good. I don't think I've surrounded myself with sadistic and deviant people. Yeah, and we just need to have more of that. We need to be open. For me, it's all about being humble and saying, I'm the most brilliant person in the room for these 5 things, but for these other 150 things, I'm not the most brilliant person. You don't want to come to me. But part of my quality is I can find you somebody who is brilliant in those other 5 things that you need. And so, yeah, there is a humbling and that feedback. And remember, listeners, we learn more through our mistakes than we do through our successes, right? So,
Yep.
but yeah, it's fascinating. It's an ongoing conversation now with Fujitsu and the post office and Horizon, the government. Obviously, the TV show has shed light and galvanized, as you correctly termed, the people of the UK to have a vested interest in this subject. We'll see where it all goes.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you liked what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is Jordan Jesse Go. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. And a friendly reminder that we're always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app has just updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. To read articles that we've written on similar topics to the one we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at acceptancepod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog there. We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptance criteria, and I promise we'll be moderating the crap out of it to keep it a nice little slice of the internet. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at ktomasuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And you've been listening to Acceptance Criteria. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.